Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Grab a glass of whatever. Join us as we dive deep into the bizarre origins, surprising mechanics, and tiny fine print of games you know, or have maybe never heard of. I'm your host, Troy, and joining me is our co-host, Max, and working behind the scenes is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is a big one. It's about Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the first edition Players Handbook.
So this is the penultimate granddaddy of all fantasy role-playing games, certainly.
It really is.
I think before this, we had seen a little bit of splitting, but it's mainly coming off of original Dungeons & Dragons. And then you have things like Tunnels and Trolls being kind of like a sort of early offshoot. But for the most part, this is really, when we think of Dungeons & Dragons, this is it. Oh, I should also say that Basic Edition would have predated this a little bit. And the origin of this one is, actually, it's nothing particularly special except that Gary Gygax wanted to have a much more formalized version of the rules, which up to this point were borrowed from another game, that being Chainmail, and then kind of amalgamated with Dave Arneson's Blackmoor, which then became Dungeons & Dragons. So in a way, it's this sort of patchwork quilt of different systems and ideas, and that ends up getting rewritten in Basic. But the idea of there being formal, especially tournament play, which for some reason, well, I mean, they're trying to promote the game, and tournament play is a good way to expose people to the actual action of playing it, which I'm sure, Troy, you will mention later, isn't as obvious in this book.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, but it creates more sort of like, here's how you play it. Now, in all fairness, that is more in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which we will be covering next episode. But in this episode, we get what is basically the player-facing part of the game. And it was created in 1977, more or less the whole set. Though I do believe from reading the notes about the book is they wrote the monster manual first. This is actually probably the last book written, though I don't know exactly when they were published or released.
Interesting.
This book actually refers to the monster manual a number of times.
It does, specifically when it's giving you breakdowns of the races and backgrounds. It'll give you specific, like, go to the monster manual for more about what a mountain dwarf is.
Yeah, mountain dwarves, different variations on halflings, different variations of elves. It's all in the monster manual, apparently. But in this version, in the Player's Handbook, they give you kind of the base standard, which very much depends on which race you pick. So the basic Dungeons & Dragons before this, and we will be doing an episode on that on BX at some point, but that one is a box set with slimmer volumes because it's a lighter rule system. This is like one of the earlier examples of a role-playing game being given a textbook printing. And yeah, it comes in at about 128, nearly 130 pages. 2-column printing, very small type.
Yeah, it is a narrow squint read.
You were calling it a squinter. It's got to be 10 point or less in font, which is from working in publishing design, 10 is like you're pushing readability when you pick 10 point font. And of course, it had at least the edition we had, which was a second printing, has the famous David A. Tramburet cover of the idol, which is actually a really cool painting if you see the whole thing laid out. You can kind of see the rest of it on the back of the book, but it's also been cropped from the original painting. But it's got an idol, and there's some kind of thief gouging out or not gouging it, but like getting ready to like take one of the jewels out of its eyes. And there's a bunch of guys milling around on the bottom, and I think there's they're like dragging out bodies in a net or something. I'd have to look at the image again, but yeah, very evocative image, and it has that kind of naive, clumsy art look that I think is really charming.
Yes,
it's unrefined, but in a way that it's kind of like your brain kind of builds the fantasy out of the sort of primitive painting that's presented to you. So yeah, this book is formally connected to 4 books. It's one of 4, which are referred in this book as being, and we don't normally think of this, but the Player's Handbook, okay, we all know that one, Dungeon Master's Guide, We're all fairly familiar with that being an edition.
Yeah.
The Monster Manual, of course, and Demigods and Heroes, or the Demigods and Heroes book, is apparently part of that, and is said as much in this book, which I thought was weird. And that book itself has its own bizarre history that I think we should probably cover that.
That would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's an odd one. That has some connections to Sandy Peterson of Cthulhu fame.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued.
And it has a history of being censored and banned and having all these other things, mainly for copyright reasons. But it does mention like demons and devils, which is obviously something that comes up later in D&D's history.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something, again, that's kind of typified by this cover, is it does have that kind of, when I was really young and getting exposed to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons for the first time, there was a certain like cool older brother spookiness to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's funny because you are the older brother in your family, but
I'm the older brother, but that was the scenario. However, like it totally had that vibe to it.
No, I totally get it.
That isn't as much a characteristic of it nowadays, but at that time it was kind of cool.
Yeah, it had a bit of an edge. Before we sort of get into like the system itself, which I will make a note is not fully described in this book, and from what I can tell, that was intentional on Gary Gygax's part. Excuse me.
Yeah, they literally make note that it's more fun not knowing the rules, and that players are excluded from reading the DMG guide. That's not it's not their purview.
Yeah.
And they're better to understand the rules in more of a loose interpretive sense, where they're just expressing narratively what's important to them.
It's definitely more focused around character creation and a more overview interpretation of how the game is played. So yeah, so we can get into like, I think like the vibe is really interesting. That was the most unique part about reading it, because obviously Dungeons and Dragons, hugely popular game even today. And it's weird looking at this edition and seeing how, I don't know, how would I put this, quirky, and I don't want to call it stream of consciousness, because it's not really that. It is actually well thought out. But there are times where Gary's like talking to you about his ideas.
Yeah.
There's this really weird part somewhere toward the beginning where they're describing, before they describe ability scores, they're describing things like level. And Gary concedes that it might seem a little strange that the term level is used in so many different places and meaning so many different things. So you've got dungeon level, monster level, spell level, character level, those being the main ones. He describes immediately after, we were thinking about calling them all different things, and that would sound like this. And so I'll give you the example of what he gives. So it would be character rank, monster order, spell power, and dungeon level. I kind of see his point, but then they don't do that. So it's weird. It's like you're reading like an alternate version, but it's just baked into the rules. It's like, so I was thinking of doing this, but then I decided to do this. And the book is just full of these weird little asides and pretty quirky little call outs to, I guess, the design process. I think that's the most direct one for sure.
He kind of brings you in to his thought process in a cool way. And he's a smart guy. So it is a very intriguing, proposition to get to see where he was coming from through a lot of this.
Mm-hmm.
But it does make reading it harder. And that's the thing that I took away. I had a really great time with the imagination of the work and the possibility scope of it, especially in the advancement of the different classes. But wow, was it hard to actually parse through everything and find what rules were tables, what rules were just baked into paragraphs, what rules were like explained to you as dice rules, what rules were just explained to you as a range of odds. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of like peculiarities that later will be sorted out in future editions of all types of role-playing games. But in this, I found that I had to reread something to take it away more than I didn't.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. There was a lot of going over sections and jumping back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird because the concepts in it are the same concepts that are in other editions of D&D. So you feel like you should know what these are, but somehow it still feels kind of labyrinthine as you read it.
Yeah, it does.
Like I was finding myself getting lost on things that I thought I knew.
Yeah, like some things will click for you, like how armor class works. When you just read it, you'll get a sense of how it's meant to work, right? But it's the things like how rolling the attributes work, and then what your attributes allow you to be, both racially and class-wise, can be really quite a rubric to figure out. Like, okay, what slot do I fit into after I filter myself through all these different outcomes?
Yeah. There's also a lot of expert blindness that crops up in places where certain concepts are kind of assumed to be known.
Yes.
I think that's forgivable enough in OD&D because that was effectively written for the people in that community. In this case, this is like a forward product that's playing off of the popularity of the existing game, which now has, by the time this book comes out, 2 versions of. This one being advertised as the kind of more definitive version. And again, it is a completely usable book. I was able to get all of the things I needed to understand what the book was for and how to use it, but it did take a lot of time kind of going through it.
Yeah, it was a dense read, and I like Gary Gygax's writing style. I think it's almost like fun to read in a certain kind of challenging way.
Yeah.
With the way that he plays with language and his vocabulary. Like you can see more like some modern RPG writers kind of aping that, you know what I mean? Like not to say they're just copying it, but they're also having fun with their writing, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Kevin Crawford being who comes to mind, for me at least. But I really liked the possibility scope that this game has and how there's just all these little comments, you know, like that just suggest so much thought. Like, oh, this is how poison works. And this is how you would poison someone. And it kind of like rolls out this possibility scope of the adventure that would follow from that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that to me is the strongest part of this book.
It's interesting because I want to say that this one comes from more of a base principles than other editions. I mean, maybe the difference between second and first editions is really subtle, but he's thinking about the scenario that's actually going on rather than, say, giving preference to the abstraction of rules, which is something that I find comes up more in 3rd and 4th edition.
Yes.
5th edition kind of splits the difference in a lot of ways, but I think it still holds to that gamist abstraction that then the players are encouraged to fill in those gaps.
Yes.
In this case, a lot of the rules are taken from, I think, Gary imagining in his head, how would that actually play out? And then what rules can I then apply to it?
I think you're right. And the thing is some of the rules that he decides to apply don't always make sense, not in a way that they don't work, but in a way that they don't present themselves as the most elegant solution to a problem.
No. There's also not as much an emphasis on balance.
It specifically says in the book, there's balance between the classes and the different backgrounds and races, but at no point does it actually have really any balance. And this is maybe something, not to be down on the game by any means, but this would be maybe a criticism I would also have, is when you roll your characteristics, which we'll get into in a moment, that determines your different directions your character can go. And the higher you roll for your different characteristics, the more you're given.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get experience bonuses of an additional 10% experience earned if you have certain key characteristics at high levels in certain classes. And you'll unlock subclasses if you roll well enough as well.
And I've seen that handled better nowadays, where you have like a filtering or a process of randomization, but also including things like choice. I mean, I'm the sort of person that likes randomly generated characters because I enjoy making characters, but I get more satisfaction out of playing them and developing them in game than I would necessarily from just like fantasy baseball style, like putting together the perfect character.
Yeah, I don't want to be playing like 2K Build-A-Player, like create a basketball player mode.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not trying to do that, but like the one thing I guess I would say is that like in this game, when you're winning more. It doesn't have any consideration. I mean, I guess that's like life sometimes, but it doesn't really have that feedback where if you roll badly in your characteristics, it's not going to do anything to enrich that experience. You've got to take that by the horns as a role player and make that what it is, and enjoy that. Whereas if you roll a couple 18s, couple 15s, maybe a few 12s, you'll just have your game handed to you on a plate and you could be a bard if you wanted.
Oh, yeah. We'll get into that. So now let's get into the heart of the character, which is the character abilities. So there are 6, and they are the ones that you are familiar with. It's the 6 that have always been there, at least from, well, not necessarily this edition, but from basic. So first off, you've got strength, and this is primarily the fighter's ability of preference or the necessary ability. And it is strangely detailed in ways that I don't know how to say. Other editions don't have specific roles for things like breaking down doors or bending bars.
Right.
But this does.
Well, it even equates like what your points of strength are into what you can lift over your head in a military press.
Yep.
Which is kind of funny because like it's sort of based on the fitness limitations of its era, because people can crush the numbers that they put in this book now. So it's like fighters were fit before people discovered abs.
Yeah, I feel like Gary's getting this out of some kind of statistic fitness book that might be dated.
Yes, I agree.
I don't know that he's going out to the gym and seeing what the toughest, most muscular guy, and then
he's not at Gold's.
That guy's a 15. All right, how much can you? Yeah, he's not hanging out at Gold's trying to like figure out what you can lift. So yeah, it covers a lot of different things. A really interesting aspect, and I think it's sort of suggested as an option, but it definitely is heavily implied that you should use this, is that fighters actually roll their strength on a completely different table using a D100. It's the first table in the game, first of many tables. It gives you a wider range of statistic about how many strength points you have. I think it's essentially to create that Conan kind of character.
Yeah, exactly. You get someone much more impressive with that than, say, you would on the normal chart.
There are specific instances where it gives, rather than a vague idea of like, I think this is the main takeaway from modern versions of the game, is that in modern editions, they have suggestions about how you might use that value by setting a certain difficulty compared to whatever the level of the strength is and then rolling. In this one, there's specific percentage rules about how to overcome obstacles with strength. Like, for instance, if you fail the check to bend the bars, you can't do it again.
Right. Yeah. It's just assumed that like you don't got it.
You made that attempt and it didn't go. Weirdly enough, knocking in doors doesn't work that way, but it is described as being noisy for every attempt. So if you keep failing to do it, then you're going to get some nasty attention. Very important thing to mention. I probably should have mentioned this earlier. Dungeons and Dragons at this stage is a dungeon crawling game.
Yes.
There's wilderness survival, and they do talk about what they refer to as metropolitan adventures, but it is tailored around this idea of going into a dungeon, overcoming obstacles, fighting monsters, and getting treasure. That's it.
That is the definitive Dungeons and Dragons at this stage of the game. It becomes more of a plot game later as time goes on, but here, that dungeon survival element is what drives it. And you can see that in what verbs your characters have, your player characters, right? Like look at the thief class. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
But everything they do is related to sneaking and breaking into stuff, especially around a dungeon or a castle.
And taken from a lot of the war games and other board games, companies like Avalon Hill, SPI, the rules are very specific to certain kinds of obstacles. I think the saving throws are a really good example of that.
Yeah, they really are.
So we'll get to that. Anyway, so the next one I would say is Constitution. I'm being arbitrary here. I could have picked Dexterity. This one is actually more important than I've seen it in modern editions, where, yeah, it affects the bonus of your hit points, but it also is your basic saving throw for pretty much everything. So magic, poison, there's the typical thing where like certain racial bonuses, which when we get into the character races, have specific extra bonuses. The obvious example being dwarves with poison and elves with enchantments.
Yeah, that's right.
But it feels more robust. Another one of those fun little rules that you probably won't see in any other edition is your total constitution score is the absolute limit of the number of times you can be resurrected. So if you have a constitution of 12, you can be brought back from the dead under savory means 12 times total. After that, you're going for Lich Hood or you're being turned into a Death Knight or something like that.
Something nasty.
They're making you a vampire now. But yeah, I thought that was interesting. It's like it's expressly in there. Then there's dexterity, which is the domain of thieves, and it is kind of how you'd expect it to be. It's your agility. It directly ties into your ability to not be hit by attacks, which is also supplemented by things like armor, and that's pretty typical, and ranged attacks primarily. It actually seems less developed than it does in later editions.
Yeah, dexterity becomes like the key stat for so many characters in later editions, but in this it's important, but it's not the same.
Yeah, I didn't find any really specialized rules. I think a lot of that comes around the thief skills when we get to those, but it's essentially how quick and nimble you are.
Yeah, exactly. And that's followed by more of the, I guess we'll call them mental stats, intelligence being the first. And that is key for magic users. It's going to influence spellcasting, and it's important in the way that it also allows additional languages. But I've always thought that was really contextual for your table, because a lot of game masters and dungeon masters, they just may never bring up languages out of convenience, right? At the table. Like, how many times has that ever really impacted your session? I don't know. I think that's very specific to you as a group, but it's cool.
Yeah, I find along with encumbrance, languages are something that falls by the side.
Yeah, exactly. And there is encumbrance rules in this game. Don't forget.
Yeah.
But yeah, encumbrance is quickly forgotten. Literacy rates are quickly forgotten. And so are other languages. All of those things are just like, whoa, that's getting complicated. Let's forget them.
Yeah. And I don't even think it's by choice. I think just it kind of falls to the side compared to all the other stuff that's going on in the game.
Yeah.
I think you could call on those things. I feel that there's a problem of precedent where, we weren't thinking about who you could and couldn't talk to until I remembered that that's a thing.
Right, of course.
But now I feel awkward for bringing it up, so I won't.
Right, it's like, you can talk to goblins, but not hobgoblins? Yeah, exactly.
And now the goblins don't understand you because I remembered languages was a thing.
Right. It is interesting and important in the way that it helps just make the different races distinct from each other, but it's not game breaking if you don't include it. So I see what happens there. And it's not like someone is speaking Elven at the table for you to be like, oh man, what is he saying?
I also found the way that intelligence is described as being kind of unusual. Like, it seems to overlap with some things that we would assume. I'm trying to think of an exact example. Mnemonic ability, reasoning, learning ability outside of the measured by the written word. So it's weird because we usually think of intelligence as book smarts.
Yes.
In a lot of ways.
That's right.
But it's not in the book. It's not specifically that. It's more like IQ or aptitude.
Yes, it is like a way more of that. It even says IQ in the book, actually. It makes specific reference to that. And to contrast that off wisdom is almost like dexterity is, in that it will grow in importance as editions go on, and other properties use that stat in different ways, like from the OSR community and stuff. But I mean to say, like, wisdom is predominantly related to clerical spellcasting and also resistances to magic.
Yes. And that's about it for the most part.
Yeah. It's not used in the same intuitive, spiritual way that you will find it picked up on later. Does that make sense?
Yeah, even though they actually describe intuitiveness as being a characteristic of wisdom, it doesn't expressly say that.
Yes.
Because even things like listen is actually a thief skill.
Right.
I mean, there's this whole thing about how exclusive are thief skills. I mean, when we talk about the thief, we'll get into that. But yeah, it covers a number of things, but it's mainly clerical casting and magic resistance for the most part.
And we wrap this up with charisma, with the impacts of leadership, I guess, social awareness and comfortability, people's ability to manage henchmen, not hirelings, but specifically henchmen, which is an interesting distinction.
Yeah.
But what they are able to do is attract a certain number of followers that are like devoted to them, to a certain number based on your charisma. And they're interesting because a hireling is just kind of a really low basic NPC that doesn't really need much in the way of definition, really. But when you look at a henchman, they actually have a class and a race. They're kind of considered level ones, but they do actually have a bit of a presence in the world.
The way that I understand hirelings to work are they're basically like paid help.
Yeah.
Their morale is based on how much you pay them, and it's basically to do a specific job. Like, I need these guys to build a bridge over this chasm.
Or this guy's my donkey handler.
Yeah, or sages fall into this camp of thing, even though sometimes they're described as different, where you pay a guy to get some information or to look something up. You know, identify this item. That was one way of doing that.
Yep.
Charisma is interesting because it very much handles things like morale and loyalty, which are specific statistical values. It predominantly affects henchmen, which are basically people who like you enough to hang around you.
Yeah, people who will take risks on your behalf, not exclusively to their own detriment, but as a part of their commitment to you.
Yeah, and there's some debate as to how henchmen are handled. Are they an extension of that player, or are they run by the dungeon master? I mean, I think it's handled at the table different ways.
Yeah, this is still a version of Dungeons and Dragons that has the caller mechanic.
Yeah.
You know, the player nominated by the other players to be the one that organizes and declares actions to the dungeon master. So it kind of makes sense that the DM would still be the one piloting these NPCs around.
I think that's the assumption. There's a great point about, so that I don't forget while we're mentioning it now, there's a great point in describing what the caller or leader does, that if the caller says we're doing this and everybody else says that they're doing something else, that the party is now in confusion.
Yes, I love that.
That was like, oh, I should try doing that at the table sometime.
I know. It's like putting a real world timer when a party is like debating, like, how do we go in the goblin room? And then you just like in your head are counting down from 2 minutes. And when 2 minutes hits, the door opens either way. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Random encounter.
Like, I like that kind of stuff, because the worst is when the players are getting caught up in a meta conversation for 45 minutes before the real gameplay starts again.
Yeah, I've always considered the random encounter to be the lash that moves the game forward.
I understand. But yeah, that would be the characteristics that define, I guess, the meat and bones of who your character is.
Yeah.
But the character class is where things get interesting. And that's where you're going to define your place in the world, sort of your profession, but not exclusively. It's not quite like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, where you like, I rolled soldier, you know, so I am a soldier man. In this, it's like you're a fighter, which could mean soldier, but it could mean a ton of things. And it's up to you.
Yeah, it's more like an archetype.
Yes, I would totally agree. It's a lot more of an archetype than a specific profession or job. And there are a number of them with subclasses as well that are available to you depending on the outcome of your characteristics.
So your 4 basics officially have been amalgamated together in this edition, though I don't think for the first time. They are fighters, clerics, magic users, and thieves.
Yep.
The naming convention is interesting because magic user is a holdover from when fighters were called fighting men, but they don't go from magic user to calling them wizards, though I assume you could just call them that in game, or sorcerers, or...
Well, that's the name of one of the ranks, right? Like, I think it's like a level 10 or something is a wizard or something. No, level 10's necromancer.
Oh, yeah, we'll get into the naming ranks because they're really...
They kind of rule, but it's weird.
Yeah, it also feels like Gary cracked open a thesaurus and was just like, that one, that one, that one, that one.
In order of grandeur, please.
I mean, necromancer, we have an association of what that means. It hasn't always meant that. In fact, I think in its most early usage was just another word for sorcerer.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't specifically connect with the dead, even though it would suggest that in the name.
In the very name, yes. Or communing with the spirits somehow.
Yeah, something like that, like a medium or something. So yeah, we got those. And then we have the monk. And we'll get into that at the end because that is the odd duck.
I do love the monk. I think some of the mechanics that make them up are really weird and kind of out of place. But I do love what the monk is thematically and how different they are to so many other classes. But they definitely are coming out of left field.
I like the idea. I like the way they're broken down, but I don't feel like they belong here. I feel like they belong in a different game with, and then in later editions, especially when we get into second edition, they are in a different game. I mean, it's still Dungeons and Dragons, but...
Well, I think the myth or the legend of the monk is just there was a guy who wanted to play that in the local community. So they made it and then it just stuck.
Yeah.
It wasn't part of like the original design vision to have this class, but someone wanted to play something like it. So they managed to make it work and it managed to keep going and picked up steam, I guess.
Also, culturally speaking, around the early to mid 70s when this is coming out, wushu and kung fu flicks coming over from Hong Kong and China more properly were really popular. Like there was I wouldn't say they were mainstream, but they were kind of getting that way, and probably thanks to people like Bruce Lee and his movies. And
that makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Created more of a mainstream appeal to a kind of fantasy that I love, but is so different from what the European fantasy that Dungeons and Dragons... I mean, if you're taking the perspective of, say, it's a sword and sorcery in the Conan vein, and we know that Gary was a big fan of Howard's writing.
Yeah.
That there is a certain kind of sort of faux Orientalism that runs through that. And so you could use that as an abridging point to put in a monk. I think that's the logic.
I see what you mean. And I think you're onto something with like how big it was in culture, because there was, what was the name of the show? Kung Fu. I think it was just directly. And it was a Western starring a famous actor of the time who just walked around doing martial arts in the West.
Carradine. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
I think that's more of like, that's the high point of that craze was.
Yeah, I think you're right. So no, I know what you mean, but some of the other classes get really interesting subnotes too, though, because fighters, they get broken out into both paladin and ranger.
Yep.
Which are also, they're very distinct from what the fighter is. And the paladin, they're sort of like a knight in shining armor, but they're also kind of like the law enforcement of the world too.
So there's two, I would say, party contentious classes.
Yes.
Troy and I have identified, and those are the paladin and the assassin.
And those come from the fighter and the thief, respectively. And each of them has very specific alignments that they have to follow, which just makes them incompatible as party mates, effectively.
Yeah. So you when you bring those characters, like, you're going to have some interesting stuff going on if you bring both in. It's potential that the assassin could hide their identity from the paladin. There's some qualities of the paladin that make that... Well, it's been a debatable thing about what detect evil actually does.
Oh, okay.
But that's a whole separate debate.
That's a podcast.
I mean, I'll touch on it, but we'll get through this part first. But yeah, you're either playing a cop or a killer.
Yeah, and they don't sit on the same side of the law.
No, and they have very specific kind of things that distinguish them, even regarding level progression. Like, well, we'll get to the assassin, but yeah. So we have the paladin, and you could also describe the paladin as, there's multi-classing in this game, and I actually think that's cool. It's probably the more fun way to play, even if there is a level limit to it.
Right.
But playing a paladin, if you qualify, this is an important thing to say, character classes need certain stats.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about earlier. You need to have minimum rolls on your characteristics to qualify for these subclasses.
Yeah. Even for some classes in some cases, though they're obviously the requirements are easier for the core class.
But if you wanted to be a paladin, you're going to need to roll well. And then you're going to need to have a party that's largely aligned with your alignment, with your values. And if that works, you're going to have a really exciting playthrough. But it kind of requires several things aligning perfectly with your alignment.
Yeah, like it says that you need at least a strength of 12, an intelligence of 9. That's not so bad. There's a lot of classes that have that. Wisdom of 13, constitution of 9. But then you need a whopping 17 charisma.
And that's where the knight in shining armor image kind of comes to my mind from, by just having that leadership and that force of personality, right?
Yeah, it's that gallant knight.
100%. The other fighter subclass that I really like, though, is ranger, because they get access to magic at their higher levels. So when you play a ranger, something we were talking about before we started recording, it's kind of like you're doing the multi-class thing without having to engage with all that comes with multi-classing. You get to sample both being a combative character, having some type of skills, very like limited to wilderness specifically, but having some type of ability. And then you will get druidic abilities as time goes on. And we can talk about the subclass druid now that comes out of cleric.
It's funny that I find that the two fighter subclasses are actually kind of like a multi-class of the cleric and fighter and the druid and fighter.
Yes.
I mean, there's some unique things between those as well. But yeah, so you have clerics. That's your divine caster. They've got the healing properties. They're considered pretty core in a lot of cases. And they have a fighting ability that's not quite as good as a fighter's, but it's not a magic user by far. There's some restrictions, like they can't use piercing or slashing weapons. But other than that, they're actually, I've heard them described as being pretty self-sufficient.
Okay.
Like they don't require a lot of feedback with the GM, because obviously the magic user has a lot of bookkeeping to do.
Yes.
The fighter also has a lot of like deliberating with the GM, like, oh, I want to like run off this wall and like body slam this guy and then stick my knife through his head.
Yeah.
But the cleric's like, oh, got all my spells. I don't have enough combat ability that would really have to be argued.
Yeah, I basically just want to hit stuff with a mace as hard as I can while protecting myself.
Yeah, and then cast heal or some like warding spells.
Some turning or whatever.
Yeah, do a little turning if there's undead or demons. So yeah, the cleric, it's an interesting one. The druid is a different flavor of cleric.
They're a neutral alignment cleric, right?
Yeah. Because
they're all about balance. So they work in different party compositions, if that matters to you. And they have a lot of flavor. I mean, they're kind of like this connection to an ancient world, but brought forward into this setting. You know what I'm saying? So they're really thematic and interesting. And if you want someone that is, I mean, they're not as fighty as a core cleric, but some of their abilities will surprise you with what they can do to empower the druid.
From times I've played druids, the ability to charm animals and entangle people with vines it's pretty choice.
If you don't have to fight wild packs of wolves ever again, I mean, that's like 50% of random encounters cut out of the game.
Also, depending on what edition you're playing, Shillelagh is badass.
Yes. 100%. Yeah, and if you can turn into a bear, I mean, like, forget about it.
Yeah, exactly. The physical transformational abilities aren't as codified as they might be in later editions, where that's very much a feature of the class.
Yeah.
But it is present in some of the spells here.
Mm-hmm.
Though it definitely higher level ones.
I really like both Ranger and Druid. I found them very thematic and very intriguing. But the one subclass that I don't like as much is the one that comes under Magic User, and that's Illusionist. I feel like that's a little bit of a watered down version of a Magic User who's kind of like the star of the show. It's Dungeons and Dragons, your Magic User, your wizards, the people that can engage with spell books. They're the MVPs.
I mean, illusionists they're interesting, I suppose. I'm just looking at the book now and seeing what the change in qualifications might be. So you don't need like super high stats to be a magic user per se,
right?
Though it definitely helps.
Yeah.
But yeah, illusionists need like a minimum 15 for intelligence and a dexterity of 16, which is pretty crazy. So yeah, I find it weird that that's supposed to be the better version. I think they have some more flexibility on item usage.
Oh, okay.
Is what I was gathering. So there are some items that like pure magic users can't necessarily use, but in this case, they can use all potions that aren't fighter potions.
Yes, that's right.
They can use illusionist scrolls and magic user scrolls. In a lot of ways, they're kind of like a magic user thief.
Yeah.
But my experience in playing around with this, whether it be in a video game that uses AD&D rules or just playing around with it, is that playing a thief illusionist is actually kind of the best use of that class.
Yeah, I could see multi-classing that into something fun, or two-classing, because it's weird. We're still in that era. But
I know that thieves they do have some potential to use magical items or scrolls, but you get a much better version of that if you pair it with the illusionist. But you're right, like looking at it, it seems like illusionists are the harder to qualify, but not as good overall.
Yes.
Like for instance, their spell list only goes to seventh level spells, whereas the magic user goes all the way to 9th.
Yeah, right.
Some of those 7th level spells are pretty good. I'll grant them that. And it's even described as they're kind of weak at first and then they get better over time. But I think considering the difficulty of this edition of D&D, I wouldn't bet on your illusionist getting that far.
No. In a world full of monsters, legitimate traps, like mean traps that are not fun to play with sometimes.
No, not at all.
Like this is a tough sell, an illusionist to me.
Yeah. So like, I don't want to call them, because like considering the stats required to get it, I wouldn't call them like the short bus of magic users, but they're definitely not my first pick, especially just by themselves.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And I mean, when you say they pair well with a thief, it's like a thief can already do so many cool things that it's almost like just be the thief. They've got the skills, they can hide, they are going to be essential to scouting around in your dense dungeon environments. They also work in the metropolitan adventure capacity. They are not as efficient in the wilderness, of course.
No.
But the thief can really, pardon the pun, open doors for you. And the subclass assassin, I love. I mean, it's alignment evil no matter what you do. So again, it's going to change your party composition. But you're just like a somewhat worse thief who can backstab someone to the moon. Like you can insta-kill people built right into your character. So they're really interesting. And they do share something that the monks also have that I love. I was bringing this up earlier to Max, but when you're progressing through the higher levels of both monk and assassin, there are NPC masters that you need to confront to take their level from them. And they go down in experience. Like think of it like playing soccer or football in the UK, right? How your team can get promoted to a different league. It's kind of like that's what you do. You relegate them to the league behind you, and then you take their spot. And I just love that number one headband chasing that you have to do with those classes.
Yeah, it definitely adds some in-game motivation directly tied into your class. I mean, we should talk about the thief because we've been kind of hinting at that. But yeah, so the thief is, again, doesn't have a hit die quite as low as the magic user, but it's pretty on the lower side. You really don't need a lot to qualify, though a lot of good stats like dexterity and I think intelligence are considered to be pretty useful. And then you have a whole bunch of skills. And interestingly enough, these use a percentile system.
Yeah.
And are notoriously wonky in those starting values. So you have things like pickpockets, open locks, find and remove traps, move silently, hide in shadows. These are classic kind of things. You have listen at doorways, and then you have some bonuses to ascending and descending, and then you have, of course, the notorious backstab, which functions a little differently than it does in other games, but the assassin definitely makes that a whole other level. But there's a table of progression for each of these skills, and I love that hearing noise is 10% at level 1, but climbing walls is 85.
It's really weird.
I don't like pickpocket 30, open locks 25, remove traps 20, move silently 15.
Yeah.
Hide in shadows 10%. Roll a D100 and you are 90% going to fail the thing that we would think a thief. Like if you're thinking about the fantasy thief.
Yes.
Some people might say the Grey Mouser. Better example might be Bilbo.
I think Bilbo, the hobbity thief, is such an iconic depiction of this, and I really think that's what this book is saying your thief is, right? Because that's what Bilbo gets called all the time.
Halflings are a statistically good fit.
They are.
For thieves as well. They're a preferred class. Ignoring the fact that he has a magic ring that makes him invisible, what he's attempting to do most of the time is hide.
Yes.
Sneak around, scout, steal little bits of treasure if possible. Again, I'm not going for the specifics because there's a certain vibe to The Hobbit as a book. But yeah, it's this sort of like stealth and trickery thing. Mm-hmm. But it's like the best thing I can do is climb.
Yeah, I'm actually really good at scaling castle walls. What I do when I'm in the castle, I get 1 in 10 odds of success, but I will get into the castle.
I feel like that's something that like even the fighter should be able to do, which is funny because people would like send Gary letters about like, well, shouldn't the fighter be able to do like, scale a wall? Or how do you scale a wall when you don't have the wall climbing? I think it's in some cases it's better described as like sheer faces, but in this case it's kind of vague. And you can see why people would be a little confused.
Not to super sidetrack us, but I like the variants of this where everyone's a fighter. Everyone's a thief.
So there's some house rulings that are more, I guess, what refer to as the sword and sorcery twist, where you just give everyone the thief skills and you might mix up what the progression is. So like, yeah, the fighter would probably be better at climbing than, I don't know, read languages, which the thief doesn't even get until level 4.
But the thief is it's a really cool class. It allows you to do stuff that isn't punch or cast. Everything that isn't punch or cast or look at dirt, thief, right? That's what they do. Mm-hmm. Because your rangers and your druids will cover your outdoor shenanigans. Your fighter and your paladin will just wreck things for you. And then you've got your various magic users to magicify things. But your thief, it's like they can do everything else, which makes them really important, but also they are ultimately a fragile character.
Also, the backstab is, even with the thief, is intense. So basically, essentially first strike on an unknowing target with certain weapons, club, dagger, sword. I'm sure you could allow for some other similar things, is damage done per hit is twice normal damage of the weapon used 4 experience levels of the thief per 4 experience levels. So that's like, even right away, you're doing double. And then every 4 levels, it multiplies again.
That's very much how this edition also handles things. It has a very weird rubric of producing your modifiers and your outcomes. It's like for the monk, for example. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
But that's nothing compared to what the assassin can do.
Yeah.
Because the assassin has a totally separate table, which they roll, where quite a number of the outcomes are just thing dies.
Yeah.
Just insta-kills whatever you rolled on. otherwise it functions the same way, but it's like their other thief skills are staggered, I think by 3 levels, but their ability to backstab is like a whole other thing. Also, the way that it's described, there's no table for it. It's just a description of like, this percentage is death. And it's like, what? Did they run out of tables? There's so many in here.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, as much as I think that the assassin is contentious, and I totally see why it was taken out in later editions, one thing I thought was really cool is, and we haven't mentioned this, experience in this game is rewarded for recovering gold.
Yes.
So 1 piece of gold equals 1 point of experience. And you could equate that to like, if you found an item that was worth that much gold, then you'd get that much experience. And it makes it more of a treasure hunting game. It's not necessarily about fighting monsters, which is something that comes up more in 3rd edition and later, but it's more about outsmarting or avoiding threats and then getting that sweet loot.
Yeah.
The fun twist on assassins is that they get experience for assassinating targets based on the amount of gold that the target would bring in for killing them.
Yes, they can do hits. And that just makes them, like, it just gives them such a different dynamic to the rest of the party, but also you better have a party that's not going to try and stop you from doing that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's all kinds of unusual restrictions. Oh, they also can disguise themselves, which is fun. And it's strange that the thief, that doesn't come up. They do have a unique disguise mechanic, which I thought was neat. And it makes sense, like an assassin, you want to get close. Also, they have very specific rules about poisoning people, and you can kill someone by poisoning them.
Yes, that's a very, like, to poison someone almost implies an entire adventure.
I think one of the other problems with the assassin, and it may be the other problem with the monk, or the issue that I have with the monk, is that it turns it into kind of a solo game.
Yeah, it does. It creates a lot of individual motivation that you would go off to do on your own.
As some people in my circle refer to as protagonism.
Yes.
And then finally, yeah, the monk is just like the whole concept of a class turned on its ear.
And there's like, monks don't use dexterity for AC. They don't wear armor. Their AC is just like based on what your level is. The way that they interact with damage when from they're unarmed is based on what your level is. Like, they don't really interact with the same mechanics in the same consistent way as the other classes. So you're sort of on for a different ride. But when you get to the higher levels, you get Quivering Palm, which allows you to touch someone. Not even like strike them, but touch them. And then if you can touch them again within a certain duration of time, it's a little loose how they describe it, you effectively reverse the vibration that your initial touch created and you stop them dead. And you can do that to basically anything that's alive. I mean, within certain hit dice limitations relative to your own hit dice, but it's crazy. And it kind of puts them into the same category as the assassin like we were just talking about.
There's an unusual kind of bookkeeping that has to be done with the monk. Like, for instance, some of their extra attacks come on like every 4th round.
I hate that.
If I'm correct.
Oh, yeah. It's like, yeah.
It's so weird.
It's really weird.
It's like you can hit twice. Yeah. But only after so many rounds of combat do you get a double hit and then like another hit. What's another one? Yeah. Their unarmed strike is based on half of their hit points.
Right.
Like, that's where the damage is pulled from, which is in some ways connected to their level. It does make their hit quite powerful.
It does.
Obviously. To the point that I think it supersedes the use of weapons.
Well, I think that's kind of the point of this build, right? Is to have like the fist of iron that you can use to just waste your opposition. And it's a really fun class. In my memory of Dungeons and Dragons, I didn't expect it to be such a core class, because we'll talk about it in a second, but there are other classes that are withheld into the appendix.
Or one, at least.
And a unique feature of the class system is the ability to multi-class, to be 2 classes at once, where you will actually split your XP between your different classes while maintaining the ability of both classes.
So there's another term, which is called 2 classes. It's just a different thing.
Yes, that's right.
And that's also confusing. Thanks, Gary. So this is actually playing as 2 classes from the get-go. So you've got Cleric Fighter Magic User, which is like, whoa. Cleric Ranger.
I like that one. Yeah.
That one's peculiar because they already are kind of druids. Cleric Magic User. Whew. Cleric Thief. Odd. Cleric Assassin. Fighter Magic User. Which actually, that's cool. The Spell Sword, as some people have deemed it. Fighter Illusionist. Neat. That's kind of evocative. Fighter Thief. That's a classic.
Yeah, that's the coolest.
Fighter Assassin. You gotta get an idea of what that might be like.
Got like a cool, like, villain.
Yeah. Fighter Magic User Thief, which is sort of like the grab bag.
Yeah, really.
And then the Magic User Thief and Illusionist Thief. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is that aside from certain racial pairings in some of these cases, it can only really be handled openly by humans, and there's still a level cap. So different classes go to different levels, and multi-class characters usually go to the more deficit of the classes. So if one class only goes so high, then it's whatever that class is that determines whatever your level is.
And when you two class, that is, you are a class and then you leave it behind to become a new class. You keep your hit dice from your prior class, but you are now a new class. And interestingly enough, if you rely on the skills or talents of your prior class at any point during an adventure, you forfeit all experience you would earn for your new class that you have started over again.
You can also not go back to that previous class, as I understand it. I'm sure people have house ruled that, so that's not the case. Also, you need actually pretty good stats to do two classing. Like, it's not even dependent on what class you pick. I think you need basically, in most cases, scores above 15. This will kind of set up the two class idea, sets up something at the very end of the book, which weirdly enough feels like it should replace the monk in at least some kind of theming, which is the bard. It's not a core class for obvious reasons, because you need at least 5 levels of fighter and at least 4 levels of thief, give or take. You then take bard, but it's described as having the same kind of in-game sort of narrative as becoming a druid. So you have to find a druid commune organization, some druid to teach you druidic magic, and then you're a bard.
A licensed and bonded druid.
Yeah, right. I think this is odd because, as I was mentioning to you, the ranger already feels like this kind of multi-class, and I would have assumed that the illusionist would have been the third class.
Yeah, it seems much more natural. The illusionist, the storyteller, those two just seem to weave into each other so much more obviously than druidic.
Yeah, the druidic one is odd. I think maybe because the bard is of a British tradition, though I'm sure that there's other European equivalents to the idea of the guy that brings news and sings songs.
Yes, exactly.
But there you go. That's the way he went with it. Yeah. So that's the classes. Honestly, like with the main core ones there, that's almost everything you need. I think a lot of the other ones are debatable, and because they require higher stats to get certain things, they aren't considered core. Like, we really get like what sometimes is referred to as the square party.
Yes.
Where all the corners are covered. You just need one of each. In fact, there's a lot of solo video games that just base themselves around, you controlling a party of 4 characters.
Yeah, exactly.
So even though it comes earlier in the book, we also have to hit up on races. And we'll try to get through this one pretty quickly because it's kind of what you'd expect. And most of this is detailed in the monster manual for the most part.
That's true. They specifically call that out under like the descriptions of several of the different races.
Yeah.
To reference the monster manual for more information.
Just to go through it, you've got dwarves who have improvision, a prowess for noticing architectural details, as well as being able to determine their depth, sloping passages. They have a natural resistance against magic and poison. They can't cast magic, but it's sort of seen as a trade-off for that resistance. Then you've got yourselves elves, which are more magical. They also have improvision. Improvision's an interesting one. We'll talk about that maybe late at the end. And they're immune to enchantments, sleep. They can find and detect secret doors. I'm wondering do you know what that comes from?
I frankly have no idea. I like it. I think it's kind of cool, but I could not tell you what story or bit of folklore or what that is,
It's quirky.
other than to just give them a dungeon utility.
The only thing I can think of, like literary wise, before the big fantasy boom in the 70s, that it contains elves. And I could be wrong. There's probably a bunch of things. But then you've got the elves from Lord of the Rings, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
and The Hobbit. And then you have the elves from Three Hearts and Three Lions.
Okay, yeah.
Neither of those give me the vibe of like, oh yeah, secret door. It's right there.
I don't know what that is. I just think it's like a game mechanic that found a home, as opposed to something that like really narratively clicked.
Yeah. Then we've got gnomes.
From day one, we have gnomes. Never forget.
I mean, they pop in and out between editions, but
They do.
yeah, right at the beginning, we've got gnomes, which are, for lack of a better term, magical dwarves.
Yes. Magic dwarves is actually a really good way to describe them.
Illusionist dwarves.
Yeah, giving them illusionist is awesome, by the way. Like, I think that's the only way to sell a gnome to me, I think.
Yeah. They have a lot of the same things. They have some of those enemy proficiencies and languages, usually with smaller things like goblins and kobolds.
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot to mention dwarves have a bunch of advantages and proficiencies against fighting orcs and goblins, as well as evading giants. Then we got half elves, which are a peculiar, like they have the flexibility of a human, but they have some characteristics of elves. They don't get every class. There are class restrictions to race, I think is an important thing. And elves are a good example about where you can still get some of those racial characteristics while still having a lot of class options. The ultimate multi-class, if that is the bard, only humans and half elves can be those. Then you got your halflings.
Legally distinct from hobbits.
Yes. At this point, they are not hobbits, and the Tolkien estate is not suing them. They get pretty solid bonuses to being thieves. So when you look at the thief chart for skills, at the bottom it has racial bonuses, and I think halflings are the only ones that get a bonus to everything. There's a distinction about what they call, and this makes more sense if you have the monster manual, but pure stoutish blood versus mixed blood halflings.
And tall fellows, yeah.
And tall fellows, and that mixed bloods are the ones that have improvision, but stouts don't.
Right, because one is elf aligned, one is dwarf aligned.
Gotcha. Right. Yeah, so there's this weird texturing with halflings that you don't really see later on. I mean, it does crop up, but like only in specific books. And then you've got your half-orcs, which are interesting, but not that... I mean, they're basically just fighter proficient humanoids.
I would like to be a half-orc cleric. I think that's a character that could be dramatic and also hit like a truck. So I think that could be a cool character. But I didn't love the way they describe the half-orc, because they make it seem like the half-orc is like guaranteed to be probably a bad guy. I like the idea that you could be a half-orc who is of different temperaments or dispositions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was attracted to the idea of using a half-orc, but slapping him as a cleric and smiting some fools.
Yeah, that would be fun. Or I'm not sure, but they might allow a cleric fighter.
Oh yeah, that would be really good.
Yep, cleric fighter. That's an option. And then you have humans, which are special by not being special in any way.
Yes.
Well, that's not entirely true, because there is the ability to basically be any class and have total flexibility over anything, but they have no special advantages or disadvantages.
Yeah, that's right. Everyone else is measured against the human. So the human just represents nothing, or not nothing, but they represent a baseline that everything is graded against. So everything else is what is unique, so to speak.
Oh, and they don't have a level cap. That's the other thing.
Mm-hmm. Right. They have unlimited potential. One dated aspect of this is the gender-specific ability scores, which will be dropped, but it's worth mentioning that they're here. It's not like major, but it's just sort of something that the game will not continue with.
And from what I understand, at least the way that most people who I've heard talk about the game is that people were ignoring that from the get-go.
Yeah, I understand.
And I'm of the mind that, we can debate whether, like, how much that may or may not be a relevant thing. But in the case of a game, you are playing the exception. Like, the player characters are the exception. And so having an unusually big and brawny woman, that's your character. That's who you're playing.
Yeah, yeah.
How that reflects into the rest of the world could be different, or some things might have more of that gender parity, but your character is whatever you want to play as. That's always been my take.
Yeah, you're like the crest of the wave. You're the foam. Can be anything,
Yeah, exactly. So the idea that, like, I understand kind of where it comes from, but it doesn't fit into the player character archetype in my mind.
Yeah. And once you've got a class, you've got a race, you're still not done. There is something we've talked about it a lot so far because it is very core to these things, but it is your alignment. And this is going to be the 9-point alignment system that so many of us just sort of assume is still how it works, Like, to all of us who grew up with this alignment system, this is still kind of the alignment system, regardless of what anyone is telling us today.
I mean, it's a meme at this point. Like, it
basically,
if you go to like D&D memes, inevitably one of these is going to come up where people have an example, or the other one is that people give their example of what famous movie characters are what alignment, right? And then that starts a really noisy debate.
Yes, every time.
So yeah, you've got your lawful, neutral, chaotic going one way, and then you have your good, neutral, evil going the other way. And then it's a combination between this crossing diagram. I don't know. What's your feeling of alignment? I've always had mixed feelings. I get why it's there. I understand what its mechanical use is. I have my own way that I like to handle it if I do use it.
I like alignment when it's more of a guiding principle or philosophy, less like a codified thing that you're an adherent of.
Right.
Like in this, it's not that there are gods and then underneath that is lawful good. There's lawful good and there are gods underneath that. So the alignment is the supreme identity. And that to me is not my favorite way of doing it, because I like it to be expressed through play more, through like your choices of character, as opposed to it being like as strapped down as some depictions of alignment can be. And that tends to be my perspective on it.
This kind of comes back to the paladin detect evil or detect alignment ability that I had brought up before, which is different ways that it's described. Some people just assume that it detects the alignment of anything, but in some descriptions of the rules, it's described as only being able to detect the alignment of supernatural entities. So if you go by that rule, then the paladin can't tell that the assassin is neutral evil because they're mortal.
Yeah.
And I think that's more interesting if you're going to do it that way. But some people just flat out drop this. It does make certain things challenging when, say, you have certain spells that react to certain alignments. But in some cases, you can just make that call when presented with that. Like if you're fighting a demon and someone's using turning, obviously you're the good guy and you worship the good god that opposes that demon. Therefore, the turning should work.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's fine. Having a party that focuses around one area of that diagram generally works better. You can have the odd character out of it, but any of the old school players that I've talked to say that inevitably leads to somebody getting dead.
When the thief or the assassin tries to rob the artifact the paladin's protecting in the middle of the night, and the paladin catches them because of a bad roll, like, what happens? Does everyone just like pretend nothing happens and laughs and goes back to sleep? Or does the paladin kill the thief now? So it's like...
the story I remember hearing was from a guy who's playing a chaotic, in a good party, playing a chaotic, evil half-orc in, if I remember correctly, Tomb of Annihilation, or... is it the one that has the sphere of annihilation inside the green demon head on the wall. You know what I'm talking about, where like people have claimed to like whole characters have crawled in there, but realistically, as soon as your head goes halfway in, you die.
Right.
I think they were staring in, the cleric was staring into it, and this half-orc fighter just decides, oh, now's a good opportunity to get rid of this guy, and throws him in.
Like, yeah,
This is why alignment is a little bit, I think it's when people take it as proscriptive instead of descriptive.
That's a really good way to phrase it.
But there's a tension, like how's it going to describe you if you don't actually act that way? So there's obviously internal reasons why you could say, like, I think it's easy enough to play a neutral or lawful evil character because they could see the party as useful. And so they would protect them to the point of achieving their own goals.
Yeah.
Little hard to see how to keep that character in the mix because once they've got their goals, they'll either leave or betray them.
I think conflicting moralities and conflicting alignments require a certain like cooperative sense in the role play where everyone is striving to create the best unified story as opposed to worrying exclusively about their personal story.
True.
And that should be the case anyways to some of us. But at the same time, I think that's like thing you have to wrap your head around with alignment is it doesn't allow you to kill the cleric. You know what I mean? It's not a permission to be a jerk to your party mates, whether you're the lawful good or the chaotic evil. Either can be sort of the unfun member of the party at either ends of the spectrum there.
Yep.
But that's the downside. But I like it because there's a certain war between the cosmic forces that it talks about, between the push and pull of law and chaos and good and evil, and sort of like how the magistrate might be lawful evil, even though he's part of the same government that a chaotic good guy druid who's an advisor to them might be related to. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like,
yeah.
It creates these cool permutations of character. Like one thing I like about D&D, about this type of fantasy setting, is it's not very factional. It's very individual. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's actually some debate in early issues of Dragon magazine where they talk about how realistic it should be. And that seemed to have been, at least when this book was coming out, a lot of the conversation following it was like, how much should it be the way that you're describing? And I agree. I actually like that it's now is sometimes referred to as like a bit gonzo, but I don't think it's really that, because I think, quote unquote, being gonzo is more of a deliberate choice.
Mm-hmm.
As in this case, it's more just like, we're just having fun.
Yeah, we're having fun. And like, I was asking my friend what he liked, Darren, who was on our Call of Cthulhu episode. I asked him, like, what do you like about Dungeons and Dragons? Like, what pulls you into it? And his response was like, when you're talking about Tolkien, there's only one or two wizards. There's only these elves, and they're all leaving. There's a couple rangers, sure, but they all work for the king. Spoiler alert. So there's all these things that like there's only one of. But in Dungeons and Dragons, there isn't just one. There's a lot. And there's a lot of all of them, which it sometimes can water things down to certain extents, but does allow for a huge scope of storytelling in a fantasy land that doesn't have some of the things. Like, it's something that Star Wars grates against all the time, where George Lucas said, there's basically no Jedi around. And now all Disney wants to do is do Jedi stuff.
Yeah.
So it's that weird tension where the lore kind of shoots in the foot, the stories the creators want to tell. And Dungeons and Dragons, that's not really the case, because it's just so unbuttoned. You can really do a lot with it. And I think the fact that it's not like Warhammery in the way where there's a high elf faction and they are separate than the dwarf faction, who are separate than this type of human faction. Like the fact that it's more mixed up and cross-pollinated, I like.
Yeah, it's less storied in a way. I mean, and I don't mean that in the terminology of it being old, because especially at this point, it's not. But even like Gary was pretty resistant on even releasing Greyhawk as a setting for quite a while, because he wanted to encourage people to make their own world, like you said.
Uh-huh.
And it's actually funny because the most known fantasy setting connected to D&D is Forgotten Realms, which I have frequently criticized as kitchen sink fantasy, where it's everything thrown together and it makes no sense. If you like it, you like it. And I know that there's some stories that definitely carve out little parts of the world and make that interesting. But it is playing into what you're talking about, which is the roots of D&D are kind of anything goes.
Well, that's the thing that makes D&D, I think, so endearing, is because it's like a great improv partner. It says yes and all the time to you. And it's not really going to close a door. And sometimes that can lead to like silly things, like in this typically Euro depicted fantasy setting, why do we have monks? Where do they come from? And it's kind of because the game doesn't want to say no to someone wanting to have that adventure. So let's put it in. And I think that kind of leads to a setting that is perhaps kitchen sink in its ways, right? But some of the advantages that you can pull from that. And it's almost like if you pretend that you're the only person telling a story in that world, then it doesn't feel like everyone's a wizard. If you're thinking of it like World of Warcraft, where we're all in this one big sandbox, then it is weird that everyone has a wizard best friend, because wizards are kind of super rare. Even in Faerun, they're still considered not like as rare as other settings, perhaps, but they're still, something of a rarity with all the education that goes into it and the aptitudes you require. You know what I mean?
They're exceptional individuals. Yeah. Though I will say, apparently everyone knows Elminster, so
yeah,
just take that for whatever.
But it's very interesting, and I don't know. I think some of what alignment does is it can also help bridge the gap in role playing when you are having a hard time really seeing what a character is, and it can help you get over initial humps, but then it can just as easily trap you into a corner with that same extension. So I like alignment, and I like what it can do for your storytelling in this setting. But ultimately, I think this game shines where it just lets you have like sword and sorcery-esque motivation to get treasure, advance your station, like make yourself a bigger part of this world than you once were.
I mean, I think the best thing to do with most games is just kind of take it as it is to start and then play it out and see how it feels. And then if you want to change things, you can. There's no harm in taking it out either. That's the fun of the way that it's written. So yeah, let's just quickly go through. So from this point on, a lot of the stuff is pretty much just checking boxes. So we've got character hit points. Those are based on hit dice, which are determined by your class. Pretty simple. Every time you progress, that goes up. Some classes count some of that, like it said with the monk, as a way of calculating other statistics.
Yes.
And also monster difficulty is usually measured by the type and number of hit dice.
Yeah, hit dice becomes a convenient like power reference.
It's by no way perfect, but I think a lot of people have proven that quote unquote challenge rating is also pretty imperfect because it's more or less based on the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you got your character languages. We already mentioned it's debatable about how useful they are, but if you are going to use them, here's how many you should know and what they are. Then, always to me, being the more interesting part of the game is money and equipment. There's a role-playing game that comes out sometime around this, or just a little after, called Metamorphosis Alpha that really goes crazy with that, and we should definitely do an episode on that one. But yeah, you have money, which everybody understands is you get a certain amount of starting gold, which in some cases you have to spend most of it and you might not get the leftovers. Some people house rule that in a different way. You have a gradation of currency. It's a little different than what most people are used to. So it's 200 copper is 20 silver, is 2 electrum, is 1 gold, is 1/5 of a platinum, which is pretty different because most of the time now it's 100 to 10 to 1. And we've kind of dropped the electrum. Electrum, for those that don't know, is an alloy mixed of gold and silver. So it's half gold. One of my favorite parts is right in the currency area where he talks about how you want to think about it like a gold rush boom town where the prices of things are insanely inflated.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's just funny how he talks about oh yeah, people were getting an egg for $1. And this is in 1970s terminology. And, people are selling picks and shovels for $50 and $20. It's funny because it's he's speaking from 1970 But he's also talking about back in like 1890 when the money is worth even, it's crazy. It's worth more. And then, yeah, there's all of the equipment. And this has always been the most evocative part for me personally about Dungeons & Dragons, was picking the gear and prepping for the dungeon.
Ah, okay.
And there's a whole range. So you've got all of your weapons, their costs, clothing, which is not super detailed, but lists at least 4 different kinds of boots. They've got herbs, livestock, a whole bunch of random equipment, including some of those key items like a 10-foot pole. Didn't necessarily notice things like the mirror, but these are problem-solving devices. So mirrors are for looking around corners. 10-foot poles are for checking the square in front of you for traps.
Or the bottom of things.
Yeah, exactly. Sacks, rations. I've even heard of someone trying to... I'm sure it's a common thing that people sometimes try to pole vault with that pole.
Which inevitably snaps in half and drops you into a spike pit.
Yeah, probably.
Love it.
What are the chances of getting that to work? Then we got armor, and then that gets us into armor class. And this is sometimes the bugbear of people who are not fully... They're either familiar with more recent editions, which have a purely counting up system, as opposed to, I don't even think it's even mentioned here, but it's THACO. In second edition, it's definitely
yes,
called.
It is in the appendix. It's called THACO.
So yeah, THACO is 2-hit armor class 0. So the O is a number. As much as it gets made out to be more complicated than it probably is, THACO works as follows. So you have your THACO number, which is effectively how good you are to hit. That number has subtracted from it the armor class of the enemy that you're trying to attack. That then becomes the roll that you need to make with the 20-sided die. The part that people get stuck on is the fact that armor can be negative, and so when applied to THACO, increases the chance, or pardon me, makes it harder to hit by raising the number. So it's turning the negative into an additive because you're subtracting a negative from THACO. It's not a bad system, it's just badly explained, and it's probably because it uses this reverse negative positive thing that isn't... It's not that complicated, but it's awkward. That's how I'd put it.
Like, check this out. A shield is +1, but that brings you from a 10 to a 9. So, like, what is happening? But once you know and understand that, you're off to the races. Like, it's not a really complicated system. It's just really not intuitive or in line with any expectations you may have approaching it from the outside.
And there were lookup tables that were made to make this easier, where you had the THACO number on one side and you had the armor class across the top, and you would just cross-check whatever the value was. But it's not that terribly hard to figure out if you had to. It's just know that armor runs from -10 to +10, and THACO is just the number subtracted from that number that you have to roll. The example is THACO of 15 minus 5 AC gets you 10. You need to roll a 10 or higher on your D20. That's basically equipment, and it kind of briefly touches on the mechanics of how some parts of combat work, or at least the little that's in here. But most of that is in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which we will cover in the next episode. So if you feel that this is running rules light, that's because that's how it's written. But the one thing that it definitely details are spells. So Troy, let's talk magic.
What happens is, as much as you're picking your equipment, if you're a magic user, you're also going to be picking spells. And the spells are what make you the MVP that I mentioned a while earlier. Because the utility you get, you can do movement, illusion, combat. You can save the lives of your companions. There's so many things that magic enables you to do. It often requires very considerate timing, because it's going to place you near the end of the melee round of a combat sequence. So there's going to be a melee round in a combat turn. And at the end of that, after everyone has struck, spell combat occurs. So you have to be able to be secure in yourself and not be interrupted by an attack and forcing you to make a concentration saving throw. So, magic is probably the most powerful tool you're going to get your hands on, but it has very specific coded limitations that you have to work with and around. And some of the things you can do with magic include magical control of creatures through potions or scrolls or rings, other spells, for example. And you can use different contextual modifiers to make that easier, or sometimes it'll be harder for you to pull that off. Additionally, there are magical items and weapons and devices, something like rods or wands, for example, and these will allow you to do different types of attacks outside of like swinging a sword or shooting a magic missile. This will give you a breath weapon or a gaze attack, for example, that could affect multiple targets or creatures, and it will force saving throws to save against paralysis or petrification, pardon me. So magic becomes one of the key parts of your experience in Dungeons and Dragons. If you're a magic user, if you're a cleric, druid, or illusionist, it's going to be one of the ways that you define yourself, just as much as a warrior or fighter defines himself by the weapon they wield. You, as a magic user, will do that in your spell selection.
Absolutely. Actually, that kind of ties into the point about saving throws, which was kind of an interesting point, is that the types of saving throws in this edition are very specific. So they're things like wand, breath weapon, petrify. I think there's a trap one.
It has save against death, right?
Yeah, saves against death.
Yep.
Which that's a whole strange thing. And yeah, that's another one of those characteristics that describe this as being a dungeon game, because they're very much these kind of bespoke saving throws that are related to things that you would actually encounter in this specific environment.
Yes, 100% there.
This is one of those things that I don't miss about the game. I prefer the more broadly interpreted saving throws, either by taking the ability score and using that as a saving throw, or doing what 3rd edition did with the fortitude, reflex, and will.
Yes.
But I do get it. I do see the mindset behind that and the process going into it.
Mm-hmm.
We also end up with named spells, which are a little call out to actual player characters like Leomund, Big B, Mordenkainen. And these are we'll call them celebrity wizards.
Celebrity wizards, exactly. Yeah.
They're baked into every version of the rule book, as far as I know. And they will always be commemorated in the rules, at least in the spell section. And then finally, and this is the weirdest part, aside from the introduction of things like planes and other not really optional rules, but psionic powers suddenly show up in this book.
Yeah.
And they're weird. And most people had a hard time dealing with them because they used a completely different system. And it used what I would argue is poor terminology if you didn't read very carefully.
Yes, the usage of strength universally, as opposed to referencing the specific powers of psionics, like psionic strength, for example, is kind of confusing to me.
Yeah, so unlike the Vancian magic of magic users, where you memorize a spell, and then when you cast it, you forget it. And that's basically, it's like a one-use shot at making the spell work. Psionics work that you have psionic strength points, and there's a random chance that you will inherit or develop a psionic power, and their combat, like there's an attack power, defense power, and like a utility class of psionic. And then what you do is you spend points, depending on what power you're using, to get the effect. And that the points regain slowly over time when you don't use the power, is the short way of describing it.
Yes, absolutely.
But the fact that it's described under each psionic power as strength points, as I understand, some people who were confused and thought that it was actually depleting their physical strength.
Like sapping them, yeah.
Not everybody. Clearly, some people read those rules. Some people thought they were really interesting. Some people based entirely new magic systems on those point systems. In fact, the way that magic is handled in Chaosium games is usually a point system.
Yes, exactly.
So even that is acknowledged as being a way of handling powers. And then, there's a description of the planes, which are the elemental planes, the outer planes, which include things like the 7 heavens and the 9 hells, pandemonium, the abyss, and all of the clockwork realms. I think that's the final thing that I kind of want to put in there is like everything that you see. I was surprised because I was introduced to Dungeons and Dragons more or less at 3rd edition. At least that's when I got into it deep. And going back to this one, I'm like, oh my God, it's all here. It's in a sort of truncated form, which was expanded gradually over time, but like it's all in here. And that was the thing. That was my biggest thing that amazed me, was just like, there hasn't been a huge expansion on the ideas so much as just elaborating on the ones that were initially started in this printing.
Like, what it makes me think of is the stories you could tell today are the same stories you could tell back then. You just had different mechanics to do it with, but the possibility space that this book outlines is still what is drawn upon today for fantasy role-playing.
Absolutely. Yeah, the kernel hasn't changed at all. You know, the math, some of the specific classes and how those are handled, some of the way that abilities are handled. Obviously, when we get to 3rd edition, and I guess in some ways the end of 2nd edition, we get non-combat proficiencies. But other than those little additions, which just sort of expand the existing core gameplay, not that much is different.
It's true.
So that's our episode on the Player's Handbook. It's a longish one, but I hope you got a lot out of it. And coming up in the next episode, we will do the actual rules of the game. So until then, happy gaming, and we will talk to you then.
Have an excellent one.
We hope you enjoyed delving in today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on our website, neonlithicinteractive.com. Join us again on the next episode of Tales and Tactics.